I met an old monk in a monastery I was visiting once, and I asked him how the community was doing, and he said, well, we have people come and people go. He said, they come and they go, and they mostly go. But we're very happy that Tanya has arrived. Welcome. It's David's mainstay. And who's leaving today? Who's leaving today? Oh, yes, both are leaving today. After lunch, is it?
Yes.
So we wish you well. May the silence be with you. And also with you. No, you're supposed to say, and also with your spirit. I think I've probably been reported to Rome for not saying the right. No, actually, no, I think I said the right words. Those of you who, there's the Roman Church has just retranslated some of the responses in the Mass, so just to keep us on our toes, perhaps. Samantha is arriving today as well from London. So, I think one of the things we experience in a deepening silence, and we've been 5 days here now, and I think our silence has deepened, and my sense is we've become more familiar and more comfortable with the silence and being silent together. One of the gifts of this kind of easy and loving and silence is, prayerful silence, is that we see things, perhaps that we didn't see before. With a lot of mental noise, and I think a lot of external noise as well, living in a big city and keeping to a busy schedule and running around, life can become blurred. And one of the intriguing and fascinating and delightful things of the Celtic vision that we find in their poetry and in their tradition that we've been looking at is a certain way of seeing. A way of seeing simple and ordinary things, the natural world, the animal world, the human world, with a clarified vision, with not an esoteric interpretation, not seeing things that aren't there, or imagining things, or speculating about things that are or aren't there, but just seeing things as they are and feeling the radiance, the glow, the inner life of God's presence in everything that is. God saw all that he had made, Genesis tells us, and he saw that it was very good. And it's that vision of God, I'd like to talk about this idea of the vision of God today, which the Celtic school of Christianity gives us a special understanding of, I think. And just that phrase, the vision of God, is ambiguous, of course. Does it mean God's seeing, or does it mean our seeing God? God saw all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. It's as if that perception of God into the nature of creation, of things, informed it. That God seeing it, and seeing that it was good because it expressed his own goodness, has filled it with a perception, with a presence, with a way of seeing that we ourselves can share in. So we can see the world as God saw it. We can see ourselves as God sees us. But we have to become clear to do that, because as we all know, we see things awry sometimes. We see things and misinterpret them. And a fascinating philosophical discussion, which we won't get into because I don't think there's any end to it, is how we are able, it seems, to see the same thing. We can say that these two blue steel girders holding up this room. We can see the hills and the stone walls outside this room. We can describe them to each other in ways that indicate to us that we are in fact looking at the same thing. And yet we can also look at the same thing or the same situation or the same person and have completely different interpretations of them. So we actually may see the same thing, but do we see the same thing? Anyway, we don't have to go into that. But it does make us aware that our spiritual life can be understood in terms of vision. That if we are following Jesus as our teacher, we are learning to see him, and to see him as he really is. This is actually what St. John says. We do not know what we are going to be like at the end, but we do know, he says, that we shall be like him because we shall see him as he really is. Jesus tells us that the pure of heart, those who have learned to cleanse the doors of perception, or those who have begun to peel away the filters and the films that cover our minds, the preconceptions, the prejudices, the ways we get stuck in certain patterns of perception or behaviour, maybe through a trauma that happened to us when we sort of froze for a moment and then have not unfrozen for 30 years. So the purity of heart then is a breaking up of and a freeing of our capacity for vision from these layers that so easily distort and entrap us. In the book of Proverbs it says that without vision, meaning the prophetic vision, the people perish. And you can see that in any community, any group, or maybe any society, where there is a lack of this clarified vision. The normal procedures of life begin to break down. The relationships that make up a group or a community begin to go sour or begin to become corrupt. So without vision, without this clarified awareness and perception, we cannot survive. At least we cannot survive in a way that leads us to full human flourishing, to a full fulfillment of our human potential. Jesus tells us, as I said, that the pure of heart will see God, and this vision of God is at the core of our Christian faith, the biblical vision. What does it mean to see God? Well, very early in the Christian tradition, St. Irenaeus said, we cannot know God or see God as an object. We can only know God, he says, by sharing in God's own self-knowledge. Which is an extraordinary statement. We can only know God by sharing in God's own act of self-knowing. And what is the self-knowing of God, we might say? Well, remember St. Paul, that who knows what a person is except their own spirit within them, and who knows God except God's own spirit. And this is the spirit we have received, he says. So we have received this spirit, which is the self-knowledge of God. We know ourselves in different ways at different levels, of course, and our human development can really be understood in terms of acquiring self-knowledge. And our crises in life are often those moments when we encounter our lack of self-knowledge, or the misseeing, the misperception that we have about ourselves, which finally runs into a brick wall, and we crash into reality, and suddenly we seem to be in crisis or in chaos because everything that we thought we saw and understood is no longer there, and we don't know who we are. Sometimes when a person is in a crisis, and perhaps they've been given some very bad news suddenly, they will say, I don't feel this is happening to me. It's happening to somebody else. So, either through great joy, falling in love, fulfilling one's potential in different ways, the act of creation, the fulfillment of your skills, or making of beautiful objects, or the sharing of some truth and beauty with others in a loving community. So these pleasant and unpleasant experiences can bring us to a new threshold, a new cliff edge, in which we have to let go of some previous perceptions about ourselves. We have to realize that we are maybe called in a different direction, that we call this conversion, of course, change of direction or change of mind, in which we have to change our ambitions, change our goals, because the old goals, the old ambitions no longer satisfy us, no longer fill us with meaning. So these are ways in which, just in terms of human development, year by year, we come to know ourselves. Self-knowledge is a dynamic process. Now, there's at one stage and at one level we come to psychological self-awareness. We may realize by the time we're in our 20s or 30s that we have some problems. We may trace those problems back to early childhood, and then we have to struggle with these patterns of perception or patterns of behavior or inadequacies or repeated failures that we now become aware of and become a burden to us. And we realize that these are blocks. This is perhaps the meaning of sin in a psychological sense. That these are blocks that we need to clear in order to grow. And we then, in this early, perhaps early stages of adulthood, we begin to look for something deeper. We begin to look for a spiritual path. We begin to recognize that some spiritual discipline or some spiritual engagement is necessary if we are to come through and move on. But psychological awareness is an important stage of maturing, but it isn't the final stage. Beyond the psychological awareness, recognizing the patterns, emotional and otherwise, that we have got stuck in, we can see something beyond that horizon, which is transcendence, and which is a deeper self-knowledge. And ultimately, in the Christian mystical tradition, we're told that this deeper self-knowledge that we move into, which is, we could say, our spiritual dimension, is necessary for our knowledge of God. We cannot see God without seeing ourselves. We cannot know God without knowing ourselves. And this is the way God has made us. At some deep level, we become what we see. This is the vision of God. Seeing God not as an object, but by sharing in the divine self-knowledge, transforms us. And the act of self-knowledge, or the state of self-knowledge, of loving oneself in the fullest meaning, is the precursor, the door into our final meaning and destiny, which is our union with God, theosis, divinization. So the vision of God then that Jesus is talking about is not just having ideas about who God is, or definition of theological definition or theological orthodoxy, ideas of any kind really. It is an experience which in itself is transformative. But it's a transformation into our full, true nature. And it's characterized by happiness, which is the good news. We can't understand any of this very well, but we do know that the sign that it is happening is a level of happiness, beatitude, that we didn't have before. So I know that I am coming to know myself truly, because the level of happiness with which I'm living is increasing and deepening. The beginning of this is, of course, to recognize that we don't know ourselves. If we cannot admit our ignorance, we can't learn anything. The joy of learning is the joy of moving from ignorance to knowledge, to understanding. But you cannot teach people who think they know it all, who are not open to new horizons of understanding, new levels of new insights. So this humility of accepting our ignorance, we could call that simplicity. That's why children are such great learners and learn so rapidly and seem to find such joy in learning, something our education system seems to fail to take account of. I remember listening to a lecture once by a Harvard professor who just retired actually. She was maybe a professor of, I don't know, education, or anyway, she was devoting her post career to encouraging what do they call them? The people later in life to continue learning. And she said, when you're as a child, we learn so rapidly and absorb so much because we are so supported, or we should be so supported. Because learning is frightening. Because to learn something new is to have our vision of the world changed. And that means our vision of the world is what gives us security, a sense of boundaries, and a sense of control. So you learn something new about the world, and suddenly the world is a strange place. We see that in the Celtic literature, in Celtic poetry, that they see the world, with sort of a primal vision, and we're fascinated and take delight in that vision. But actually it can be quite scary, suddenly to see familiar things with this new clarity and new sense of the inner radiance. So we need a lot of support, a lot of emotional and social support in order to keep learning. And she said perhaps one of the reasons that we stop learning as we get older is not only because the brain cells are not repairing so quickly, or not repairing, but that because we don't have that support system of the child. We're on our own in the world. We've got to make our own way in the world, and we don't have that same strong network of support and loving reassurance. So she said, in some ways, she said, even though your brain doesn't function as well at 35 or 65 or 95 as it might have done at 5, or on the other hand, you don't have some of the problems and handicaps that you had in adolescence, for example. When you have this fantastic capacity physically and mentally to learn and to flourish, and yet you've got all the other problems at that stage of life. Whereas later in life, you're not, if you sign up for an adult learning class, you're probably not looking at the girls or the boys in the class so much as looking at the blackboard or listening to the teacher. So as she was saying, so if we could understand this, and because people are living longer, what we need to do is to create social networks in which we are encouraged and stimulated and supported in learning. And religious communities, healthy ones, sometimes do that for their older members. I remember going to a community of old nuns once, a retirement home, and most of them were in their 90s, I would say. And every year, at the beginning of the year, they have a meeting to decide what they're going to learn that year, each of them. So one of them said she was going to learn computers, and another one she was going to learn a language, and the frightening one was the one who told me she wanted to learn to drive. But so anyway, to learn to see is really what our life is about, and we need support, inspiration, stimulation in order to keep learning. And learning involves accepting and continually accepting our levels of ignorance, and sometimes actually confessing that we got it wrong, that we saw things that weren't there, or we put labels on things that were not appropriate. In the Christian theological tradition, the goal of life is sometimes called the beatific vision, the vision of God, which brings absolute beatitude or absolute happiness, total fulfillment of our human existence. And it's coming to realize that that is what we are for, why we are on this earthly pilgrimage. That's something that informed and kept the Celtic monks going, I think, on their endless pilgrimages. Their lifestyle, I remember one of the characteristics of the Celtic monk was that he felt he couldn't be a monk in his own country, and that voluntary exile or white martyrdom, as they called it, which was difficult, very difficult for them, because they clearly loved their home, and loved their clan, and loved their place of belonging. But they voluntarily went into exile, brought this culture of the gospel, this particular Celtic culture of the gospel, deep into Europe and as a civilizing force. And these great mystical monks were also great missionaries, because they carried this way of seeing. And this is really what the missionary work at the heart of, or one of the aspects at the heart of Christian identity, to proclaim the good news, to carry this to the four corners of the world. I think this is really what it means. It is a misinterpretation, I'd say, of the words of Jesus, to go forth and baptize all nations. To take that too literally means you fly over Africa with a plane full of holy water and baptize everybody, or as in the 9th centuries when the missionaries went into the pagan tribes of Europe and gave them a simple choice: baptism or the sword. What do you choose? So I think the idea of conversion is not so much, there is a sociological aspect to it, but it's not so much about forcing or bribing or coercing people into a church or into an ideology or into a belief system. It's more about showing them how you see things. It's sharing the vision. It's not quite the same as giving them, a formula, giving them the ideas. It's sharing the vision experientially, in other words, which is why the contemporary missionary understanding of missionary activity, we heard this on Sunday from medical missionary Mary's sister, who was telling us about her work in Africa, is not so much that you go there in order to convert them and turn them into westernized Christians, but that you go there and you, in all your weakness and in all your humanity, see as Christ sees you, and you try to witness by your life, by your way of interacting with the physical and social and material needs of people. You witness so that people can see in you the way God sees them. Something like that. It's a different approach to the missionary impulse of the Christian life, because that is there. It is part of that identity is to go forth. But how we do it is very, we may need to see that. In fact, I think we do see it differently. In 1900, there were two great events took place, I think, in the same year. One was a meeting of some missionary organisation in Edinburgh, and this was the height of the British Empire, and they came to the conclusion that probably within a generation there would be no more need for missionaries because the whole world would be Christian. Nothing could shake the power of the British Empire, and the British Empire brought the gospel, brought the Bible, and so everybody quite soon would be civilized and Christianized. But another event took place in Chicago at that time, which was the first meeting of a large interreligious gathering where Swami Vivekananda, the disciple of what's his name? Anyway, came to America and was wowed the Americans and went on a great tour of America and in a way initiated the era of contemporary interreligious dialogue. So, two different perceptions of the moment we're living in. St. Augustine, I think it was, who said that the soul is like an unopened parcel. And we have to open it. It's like a present we've been given, all nicely wrapped up, and we have to open it and see what is there. But what we find is not so much an object that we can possess. What we find is a way of seeing. As we open our hearts, as we open our minds, we find a new way of seeing which will always and eternally surprise us. It's one of the aspects of poverty of spirit, which sounds a little negative. Poverty is something we want to eradicate from the world. Poverty is a sign of human injustice and imbalance. But the expression poverty of spirit is not negative in that sense. It's not about a deprivation. It's more about a detachment or a dispossession. So to be poor in spirit is to enjoy what is given to you, but to see it as a gift, not as a possession. And to experience it in the giving, in the receiving, and in the sharing. And that's very difficult, because as soon as we get hold of something we like, we want to keep it. We begin to get possessive about it. We begin to possess the people we love, or we begin to possess the children you have, or we begin to possess a status that we've acquired. So poverty of spirit is learning to continuously receive this, the gift of being and its many manifestations, without closing our mind over it or closing our grip on it. And meditation is understood in this early tradition of the Church precisely as a direct path into poverty of spirit, into the first of the Beatitudes, into this foundation of happiness. Because it's in meditation that by the renunciation of all the riches of thought and imagination, as Cassian describes it, we continuously, day by day, learn to open the parcel of our own being, discover this new way of seeing, and we continuously correct the impulse that we fall into continuously of trying to possess, trying to grip, or getting caught, getting hooked by a false way of seeing. So poverty of spirit and purity of heart are intimately connected. As we become detached, we are able to see more clearly. The laying aside of thoughts in the times of meditation, morning and evening, or during the day as we're doing it, is a cleansing and a clearing of the mind and heart, so that we can enter into the vision of God, in both its aspects, God's vision of us and our vision of God that comes through sharing in the way God sees himself. So, when we think about the vision of God as a phrase, it's difficult for us to unhook it from our usual way of thinking about seeing, which is that we see something. I see you there, you see me here, and you have a much nicer view behind me than I do behind you. So, but we think of seeing always in terms of this metaphor of looking at something. looking at an object. What the Celtic poets, and indeed all poets and all spiritual perception is about, is penetrating beyond the objectness, the objectivity of what we're seeing, and into an intersubjectivity. You never know God as an object. So, and this is expressed in Thomas Aquinas's 4 points about the vision of God. The first is, he says, that this vision of God, or this union with God, consists of seeing perfectly. Just seeing what is there, without misperception, without projection, without distortion, without prejudice. Of course, we know that we can't see things perfectly, yet we see as through a glass darkly, and yet we know that we, like the man who Jesus healed of blindness, even though we may only see blurred shapes some of the time, we know that we are learning to see more clearly. And we will eventually see face to face. There will be, this is hope. This is what keeps us going from day to day, is the hope, which is a kind of conviction or a kind of certainty, not a daydream or a desire, but the hope that we will see as we are seen. We will know as we are known. That's St. Paul's mystical vision of the end of this process of seeing perfectly. The second aspect of the vision of God that he describes is perfect praise. We will see, but because we will experience perfect praise. We use this expression a lot, praising God, or in the language of worship, we speak about praising, and yet it's not yet perfect praise, because we often don't feel that spontaneous, celebratory, joyful thankfulness, which is what perfect praise is. Justification for speaking about praising God when we really look pretty miserable while we're doing it, or even worse, we're trying to pretend to be really feeling this and we're not. The justification is that you've got to fake it to make it. But you don't want to fake it too much, or you have to be able to recognize when you're faking it and when you're making it. So, and it's a subtle aspect of Christian life that I think does turn a lot of people off. And also it describes why people go in search of forms of Christian worship that are more joyful and more celebratory, and seem to come closer to this perfect praise. But anyway, that's how we begin to understand what this perfect praise might mean. But I think it's when, but we know it, when your heart sings, when you are able to see, maybe in joyful times of achievement and blessing, or times even of tragedy, of loss, you can sometimes see and feel this, similarly like times of birth or death. I mean, the moment of death, not the moment before death or the moments after, but the moment of death can really strangely be a time of perfect praise and birth. You know, after the pain of birth and before the business of raising the new life. Anyway, so there are moments, not necessarily only happy moments, where we can experience this spring of life, this joyful upwelling of vitality and creativity. And it fills us with this maybe momentary experience of thankfulness. Not even thankfulness for this or for that, but this sense of being more fully alive that we call thankfulness or gratitude, because that's the best word we have for it. So this, I think, is what he means by perfect praise. Then he says, thirdly, the vision of God is characterized by a complete satisfaction of desire. Now, a complete satisfaction of desire must mean more than we wanted, or more than we were able to imagine. It has not entered into the heart of man what we shall receive. We cannot imagine this. So this complete satisfaction of desire is a transcendence of desire as we normally understand it. In this life, no one can fulfill all their desires. So the complete satisfaction of desire suggests a transcendence and a sharing in that fullness of life, the fullness of God, who exceeds infinitely all other pleasures, as Aquinas says. Now, as soon as we begin to speak like that, we run the risk of sounding as if we're just spinning a consoling fantasy. Here in this vale of tears, we are speculating, imagining some realm of the saints, some blessed isle of the blessed, as the Celtic monks went in search of. And all religions present this idea of heaven, of paradise, beyond or in the next life. So we have to be very careful about speculating about this, and we need to be continually reining in our fantasies or our wish fulfillments and our dream fulfillments, because the complete satisfaction of desire involves a transformation of desire. There's a nice story in Boccaccio, an Italian poet, about a small town where 3 people died on the same day, all went up to heaven for their judgment. And the first was the mayor of the town, a politician, and St. Peter said to him, okay, today we have a special offer, and you can either go into heaven, or if you like, you can go back to earth for another few years. So the mayor said, well, I wonder what he means by this. That's the catch in this. And so he thinks, he ought to be say the right thing, so he be politically correct. So he says, of course I want to go to heaven. It's all I've ever wanted. So St. Peter says, okay, you can go to heaven. So he goes into heaven. And then the bishop of the town, who's also died, comes, and he's given the same choice. And he, of course, thinks immediately that this is a choice between good and evil, and he has to choose the good, so he chooses to go to heaven. And Peter says, okay, here's your ticket, and go in. And then the third person to die that day is a robber who had been hanged and been a bit of a lad in his life and was in trouble. So anyway, so Peter says to him, same special offer today. Do you want to go to heaven, or do you want to go back to earth for a few more years? And the robber thinks long and hard about this. He says, well, I'm going to be honest with you. I should say, I want to go to heaven. But to be really honest, I liked my life. I was always in trouble, but it was a good life. So, I don't know, if I had a choice, I'd go back. And St. Peter says, great. And at that moment, all the lights in heaven started to flash. And all the heavenly choirs started to sing. And St. Peter said, we finally got someone for paradise. So I think that's a Celtic understanding of satisfaction of all desires. And then finally, the fourth element of the vision of God, according to St. Thomas, is a community of supreme delight. Community of supreme delight. Because all will share all that is good with everyone. Everyone will love everyone else as himself, and therefore will rejoice in each other's well-being. The joy of each grows in proportion to the joy of all. So, these are what do we have here? We have a complete transcendence of the ego. And through this transformation of desire, the ego itself has been transcended. And so he says, actually, it's not about us all sitting in a big theatre with God up on the throne, and we all stare at this divine being on the throne for the next, for the rest of eternity, which sounds a bit boring. But he says, actually, it's more that we will turn towards each other and we will see God in each other's eyes. That's the vision of God then. So these are the, when we speak about the vision of God, we're not speaking about looking at or knowing in that visual sensory sense, or even that cognitive sense of looking at something or thinking about something. It is an experience in which we see perfectly, we experience this spring of the joy of being. Desire is satisfied beyond anything that we can imagine, and we experience a communion with all creation through the human, in and through the human.